Hello everyone, and welcome to another PowerShell tutorial. In this video, we'll learn about the PowerShell Execution Policy, which controls how scripts are run and executed on your computer. Before we go any further, if you just want to run scripts without diving into the details of the execution policy, you can use the first command to allow your current user to run any script. Run the second command if you want to allow all users on your computer to run scripts. Just make sure to open PowerShell as an administrator. You can also copy these commands from the link in the description. Depending on the current execution policy, you may or may not be able to run PowerShell scripts on your computer. Right now, the execution policy on this computer is set to restricted, which means scripts can't be run. If I try to run a script, I'll get this error. Running scripts is disabled on this system. To run scripts, we need to set the execution policy to one that allows scripts to be executed. Here's a list of the policies we can set. The first policy is restricted, which means you cannot run any scripts. The second policy, AllSigned, allows only scripts signed by a trusted publisher to be run. The RemoteSigned policy allows you to run scripts written locally on your computer. However, scripts downloaded from the internet must be signed by a trusted publisher. Unrestricted allows every script to run, but when you execute an unsigned script downloaded from the internet, you'll receive a security warning. The next policy is bypass. If you set the execution policy to bypass, nothing will be blocked, and there will be no warnings. You can run any script you want. The scope allows the execution policy to be applied at different levels. By default, if you don't specify a scope, the policy applies to the local machine scope, meaning it will affect all users on the computer. If you set scope to the current user, the execution policy will be applied only to the current user. The next scope, process, allows you to temporarily change the execution policy for the current PowerShell session. However, once you close the PowerShell window, that policy is no longer in effect. The last two scopes, user policy and machine policy, are primarily used in Active Directory domain environments to apply execution policies based on group policy settings. Scopes have priorities, which you can see by running the Get Execution Policy list command. The machine policy has the highest priority, while the local machine scope has the lowest. The important thing is that a scope with a higher priority can override a scope with a lower priority. For example, in a scenario where the local machine scope is set to restricted and the current user scope is set to bypass, the user will be able to run scripts because the current user scope has a higher priority. Before we move on to the demonstration, one more thing I want to mention is that if you have different PowerShell versions on your computer, each version has its own execution policy. For example, this computer has both Windows PowerShell and PowerShell 7 installed. Changing the execution policy in Windows PowerShell won't affect the execution policy in PowerShell 7. Now let's see how to change the execution policy. I'm going to open PowerShell as an administrator because changing the execution policy at the local machine scope requires administrative privileges. First, we will check the current policy by running the get-execution policy-list command. Right now it is undefined at all scope levels, which means that whatever the default policy is for this PowerShell version will be applied. We can see what it is by running the get execution policy command without any options. Currently the default policy is restricted. Now let's create a simple script and try to run it. As you can see, we can't run the script. So what I'm going to do now is change the execution policy to bypass. The command for this is set-execution policy, and the parameter we'll use is -execution policy. Here I am not going to specify any scope, so this will be applied to the local machine. Okay, now the execution policy is set to bypass at the local machine scope. Let's run the script again to see what happens. As expected, we can run the script without any errors or warnings since the execution policy is set to bypass. So let's talk more about the scopes. As I mentioned earlier, scopes have priorities. It is in the order it is listed in the get execution policy -list command. Right now, the execution policy is set under the local machine scope. What I am going to do now is set the execution policy to restricted for the current user scope. This time, we will use the -scope parameter to specify the scope. Now let's run the script again. And this time we get the error again. What happens here is that, even though the local machine scope is set to bypass, we can't run the script because the current user scope is set to restricted, which has a higher priority than the local machine scope. Now let's talk about the process scope. This scope allows us to temporarily change the execution policy for the current PowerShell session only. Here I will set the process scope to bypass. Since the process scope has a higher priority than current user, we should be able to run the script again. But this only applies to this PowerShell window. If I start a new console and run the getExecutionPolicy command, you'll see it is undefined, and we can't run the script. And one more thing, if you want to reset a scope, set the policy to undefined. For example, running the following command will remove the bypass policy from the process scope. In this section, we'll cover the last two scopes, user policy and machine policy. These two scopes are used to set execution policies via group policy in Active Directory environments and cannot be set using the set execution policy command. What I am going to do is create a new organizational unit called admins in the domain controller and move the user admin1, which I used to log into desktop 1, into the new OU. Okay, we have created the new OU. Now we'll go to the Group Policy Management tool and create a new GPO called Execution Policy under the Admins OU. Next, we'll edit the GPO. Since this change applies to users in the OU, we need to configure it under the User Configuration section. The setting we want to edit is called Turn On Script Execution, located under Policies, Administrative Templates, Windows Components, Windows PowerShell. Let's open the Turn On Script Execution setting, turn it on, and set it to allow all scripts. What will happen is now, any user in Admins OU will have execution policy unrestricted under the user policy scope. Now let's go back to the desktop one and check the execution policy. First, we will update the group policy using the gpupdate command. The group policy has been updated, so let's go ahead and check the execution policy now. It should be unrestricted at the user policy scope. All right. Now let's talk about the machine policy scope. This scope is used in Active Directory environments to set execution policies on a computer. Unlike the user policy scope, which applies to specific users, the machine policy applies to every user on the machine. In this example, if I want to allow anyone on this machine to run scripts, I first need to move the desktop 1 computer to the admins OU. Then we go back to the Group Policy Management tool and edit the Execution Policy GPO under the Admins OU. But this time, we need to set the setting under the computer configuration. The path is the same as before: Policies, Administrative Templates, Windows Components, Windows PowerShell, and the settings is Turn On Script Execution. I'm going to turn it on and set it to allow all scripts. Now let's go back to desktop 1 and check the execution policy again. Updating the group policy didn't work here. Sometimes you'll need to restart the computer for the changes to take effect, so I will restart the computer. The computer has been restarted. Let's check the execution policy again. As you can see, the machine policy is now set to unrestricted. Since it has the highest priority, this means anyone can run scripts on this computer. Remember, the execution policy is a security feature that helps prevent malicious scripts from running on your computer. It's a good idea at least to use AllSigned or RemoteSigned for better security. Choose your execution policy carefully. And that brings us to the end of this video. If you found this helpful, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more PowerShell tutorials.